My question today that I want to raise is the question of the meaning of Jewish sovereignty in Halacha. And looking at Yom Ha'atzmaut, not only from a national point of view, but also from a halachic point of view, and the ramifications of such a perspective. Now, I'd like to run through this briefly, but to talk about a few sources. Obviously, when we talk about Jewish sovereignty, if we look back to biblical times, we have to put it in the, I guess, in the framework of biblical thinking, which is a monarchy, because in antiquity, that's really all that they had. So, if we look back into the Torah, in Devarim, chapter 17, there is a discussion of the king, the monarch. And the Torah says in Devarim, it's chapter 17, verse 14, when you shall come into the land, and then you shall say, I will place upon myself a king like all the nations surrounding me. So the Torah says, Som tasim alecha melech, yes, you can place a king upon you, a king which God will choose. From among your brethren shall you put a king. You cannot put upon yourself a foreign king, a non-Jewish king, meaning asher lo achicha hu, who is not from your brethren. Now, already in this passage, there is something puzzling, because it starts off not as appoint a king when you come to the land, but it starts off as if within a discussion where it says, well, when you come into the land and you say we want a king like the other nations, then you can put upon yourself a king. And then the question is this then the ideal or the real? Is it what we call in halacha lechatchila, the ideal situation, or b'diavad, this is just the real situation, this is what the whims that the people are going to have because they're going to look around and they'll be influenced. So the Torah says, okay, if you want it, you can also have it. There are ways of doing that too, but not necessarily an ideal situation. In the 15th century, Don Isaac Abarbanel, commentating on in his commentary on Devarim. Now, Abarbanel, as we probably remember, was the finance minister to Ferdinand and Isabella during the before and during the Spanish Inquisition, meaning during the Gerush, during the Spanish expulsion. And he actually turned to Ferdinand and said, why do you need an expulsion edict? I'll raise some tax money and we will redeem the Jews in that way. And Ferdinand was willing to, but the chief inquisitor, Torquemada, heard about it and was able to stop the redemption plan, and the Jews were evicted from Spain. And then Abarbanel went to Portugal, where he worked in the court of another king. And then eventually he settled in Venice in Italy. And Abarbanel, writing his commentary in Italy, says, well, I have seen monarchs and I have worked in their palaces, and I can tell you, monarchs are overrated. And he says, and therefore the Torah is trying to hint to you it's not a good idea. Because look, here in Venice, all we have is local monarchy. There's no federal monarchy. And this is much better for human beings. So this is really the question. When the Torah says you shall ask for a king because you will see the other nations doing it, is this the optimal situation, or is the Dibra Torah Keteva B'nei Adam, the Torah understands human nature, and then it's telling you what to do if such a thing arises? To make the thing even more complicated, when we look at the story, the biblical story in the book of Samuel, of when the kings were appointed, meaning King Saul, the first king of Israel, and later on David, the second king of Israel. So the matter seems to become even more complicated. If I look at chapter 8, before Saul is appointed, and the people turn to Samuel. This is Samuel 1, chapter 8. And when Samuel became old and his sons were judges in Israel, and his sons were Yoel and Aviah, who were judges in Beersheba, but they did not walk in his ways, and they sought bribery and took it, and they also distorted judgment. So all the elders of Israel came to Samuel in the Ramah, and they said to him, "Look, you have become old, and your sons are not walking in your pathway. So let us have a king to judge us like all of the nations." Now, theoretically, the people are doing exactly what it says in Devarim. They're asking for a king like all the nations. And then the next verse in chapter 8, verse 6 says, Vayera davar b'nei Shmuel, and this was a terrible thing in the eyes of Samuel, where the people asked for a king to judge them, and Samuel prayed to God. So Samuel is really 100% against the idea. And then God says to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people, everything they ask you. So it sounds like God is saying, okay, that's what it says in Devarim, right? But look at the continuation. Kilot chamasu, because it is not you who are they despising, it is me that they are despising in asking for a king, etc., etc. So, what's going on? Is a king good or is a king bad? Not only Samuel against the appointment of a king, but God says it's a way that the people are turning against him. Even though he allows it, it seems like a terrible thing. So is a king good or is a king bad? Now, when you look at Samuel chapter 12, which is sort of Samuel's speech to the people after Saul has already been appointed. So this is Samuel 1, chapter 12. And Samuel says, well, this is verse 13. And now here is the king, which you have chosen, which you have requested, which God has put upon you. Doesn't sound so terrible. Then he says, if you fear God and worship him and listen to his voice and not to rebel against him, so you and your king will be fine. But if you do not hearken to the voice of God and you turn against him, the hand of God will be against you and against your forefathers. So again, it's not clear. I mean, it sounds like a king is like allowed, but it doesn't sound like the best scenario. And now stand and watch this great thing that God will be doing in front of your eyes, because we are now at the wheat harvest, meaning at the beginning of the summer. I will call out to God, and he will give thunder and give rain, and you will realize how terrible this thing has done, that you have done to request a king. And then he calls out, and there's thunder, and there is rain, and the people get scared because it doesn't usually rain in the summer season in Israel. And they say, okay, take him back, take him back. And Samuel says, no, I'm not going to take him back. Just make sure that you and your king follow the laws. So, again, from Samuel, it sounds like an after the fact scenario, but not an ideal situation. Some people try to interpret this story of the rain in the summer, meaning everything has its appropriate time. And they were sort of like early in requesting a king. It was not at yet the appropriate time for such a thing to happen. It's not 100% clear, but that's one of the possibilities. In any event, it appears, both from the scripture and from the story in Nevi'im, that the king doesn't seem to be the most ideal situation for the Jewish people. That's why it's interesting how Halacha understands this concept. And the Talmud in Sanhedrin, in the second chapter, which is really the stand that Halacha takes, it says, Shalosh mitzvot nitztavu lahem Yisrael v'knisatam la'aretz, which means 3 mitzvot were the Jewish people commanded in entering the land. This is a statement of the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 20b. It's in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. 3 mitzvot were the Jewish people commanded when they entered the land. The first one is la'amid lehem melech, to appoint a king. The second one is to destroy the descendants of the people of Amalek, and the third is to build the temple. So, since this is a baraita mentioned in the Talmud, it's understood as halacha. And the halacha seems to adopt the approach that there is a mitzvah to appoint a king. Now, you could say, why does halacha adopt that approach? If according to the book of Samuel, it doesn't look like an ideal situation, and even the Torah, you could argue the point from Devarim chapter 17, why would halacha, Rabbi Yehuda, take this carte blanche approach that having a king is an ideal situation? To understand that, you have to understand how halacha works. Jewish law will decide something based on the concept of it's a mitzvah, but it will not discuss, you might say, the qualitative value of that mitzvah. Let me give an example. There is a mitzvah in the Torah. If a marriage is not working well, there's a mitzvah to give your wife what's called a book of divorce, a divorce contract, and let her remarry. It says, the katavla sefer kritu v'shilchami beito. It's a mitzvah from the Torah. Because the man had to marry the wife, he has to also activate the divorce. And it's a mitzvah to give her the divorce, to give her the contract, to free her, to allow her freedom to remarry if it's not working out. Now, this is a mitzvah. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to get divorced in order to, in other words, when you get married, you don't have to get divorced. The ideal is to remain married. But the Torah says, if it doesn't work out, there's another mitzvah called divorce. That doesn't mean that the Torah is saying that they want you to get divorced, but it is a separate mitzvah. It's a circumstantial mitzvah. Another example. If a person stole something and it's against the Torah to steal, it says, Lo tignovu in Leviticus chapter 19, you shall not steal. But if you did steal, there's another mitzvah from the Torah called Vehishivat Agzela, give back what you stole. So, does that mean you have to steal in order to do the second mitzvah? No. If you don't steal, much better. But if you did, and you're looking for a way to repent and to mend, you can give it back, and it's a mitzvah to give it back. Ve'eshivat agzela. So, halacha will decide if something is a mitzvah or not, but it will not make a value statement about what level that mitzvah is on. It will give you carte blanche if from the Torah, from the understanding of the halacha, this is a mitzvah or not a mitzvah. So from the point of view of halacha, whether it's the ideal or the real is an interesting philosophic discussion, but de facto, there is a mitzvah to have a king, and that's the way it's brought down in halacha and Rambam in his Mishneh Torah. So, what does that mean? It means that there is a mitzvah to have a king, which represents, of course, Jewish sovereignty. Let me just read a little bit more what it says here in Devarim. So about this king, it says it has to be, of course, from the Jewish people. And also he has 3 stipulations. Not to have too many horses, so not to bring back the people to Egypt, because horses were raised in Egypt and Jews were not supposed to go back there. The second one is not to have too many wives, and the third, so that his heart shall not sway. And the third one was not to have too many riches, again, not to sway his heart too much. And then the fourth thing is a positive thing. He had to write the Torah, the Mishneh Torah Azot, which is understood as the book of Devarim, and he had to carry it with him wherever he went, with one copy at home too, because the king had to realize that the law is above him. Of course, at the time it was him. So, that's the idea of a king. The only question is, where do we go from here? You have this concept, as I said, as the idea of the king, but what is now the next step? What are the ramifications in halacha? Now, there's an interesting discussion by the Ramban, that's Nachmanides of the 13th century Spain. who in the last 7 years of his life lived in Jerusalem, built the Ramban synagogue, which is in the old city until today. Ramban has a commentary to Maimonides, to Rambam Maimonides. This is Nachmanides' commentary on Maimonides' Book of the Mitzvot, Book of the Commandments. Maimonides was the second attempt to enumerate the 613 commandments as they appear in the Torah. And Nachmanides, and when you enumerate the 613 commandments, if you actually count every place in the Torah it says do this or don't do that, it comes out well more than 1,000. So the question is, how do you get the 613, which is, of course, a tradition that there's 613, a tradition of Rabbi Simlai from the Talmud in Makot, page 23. So what Maimonides does is he explains if something comes twice, 3 times, it's only one mitzvah. If it's just a general statement like keep the mitzvot, it's not another mitzvah. He has a whole scenario there, definitions of what is considered mitzvah and what is not. But of course, there are arguments between those who enumerate the mitzvot, what is included, what is not. One of the arguments is an argument of Nachmanides against Maimonides, mitzvah 4. Whereas Nachmanides says there's a mitzvah which is called dwelling in the land of Israel, which Maimonides seems to skip, which is the discussion by itself. If he skips it in the 613 commandments, does it mean it's not a commandment, or is there another reason why he skipped it? But I just want to read to you a little bit from Nachmanides in his discussion of the 4th commandment. Interestingly enough, the name of his commentary is The Mitzvahs That the Rabbi Forgot, meaning Maimonides, which is a diplomatic way, of course, of saying I disagree with you. Because if you forgot one, since there are only 613, if you want to add, you have to subtract. But it's called the mitzvahs that the rabbi forgot. It says, what's mitzvah for? Shenitztavenu, that we were commanded to inherit the land, which means to take over the land that God has given us and given our forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, there are 3 parts to this mitzvah. Number 1 is to take over the land, and we'll see later that if not by agreement, then by force. Number 2, not to leave the land under the sovereignty of other nations. It's not enough you live in the land, you cannot give the sovereignty over to another nation. And the 3rd thing is not to leave the land desolate, to settle the land, to build houses, to plant vegetables and gardens and trees. And this is as it says, Varashtem et haaretz v'shavtem ba. So for Nachmanides, Ramban, it's very clear that there's a mitzvah to dwell on the land, and this mitzvah has 3 parts. Part 1 is to take over the land of Israel if we don't have it, if it's possible, even if necessity dictates by force, again, if it's possible. Number 2 is not make sure that there's not a foreign government, it has to be a Jewish government. And number 3 is to settle the land, that it should not be desolate. So obviously, an inherent part of it is to have a Jewish government, which would mean that he sees this as an extension of what the Torah says to appoint a king. He also says that this mitzvah applies in every generation, even during the time of the galut, the exile, meaning you have to make the attempt. So if all you can do is just make aliyah and live in the land, at least you did that part. But if you can do all 3, then you do it. Now, Nachmanides is actually brought in Halacha, even though he possibly is arguing with Maimonides, which is a discussion by itself. The Halacha follows Nachmanides, and I will prove it from 2 places. Place number 1. Now, you know our Shulchan Aruch, our Code of Jewish Law, written by Rabbi Joseph Caro and Moses Isserlish, only discusses laws normally pertinent to Jews living in the exile, in the diaspora. Because at the time there were few Jews in the land of Israel, so the law books were written for the Jews living in the diaspora. Therefore, there's no discussion of the temple, there's no discussion of the agricultural laws of the land of Israel, except the tithes and the trumot, and the bikurim and the first fruit, etc. However, in some of the discussions, they do discuss these things apropos. Let me give you an example. In the laws of, in family laws, in Even Ha'ezer, which is the part of the Shulchan Aruch which discusses marital laws, in chapter 75, there is the discussion of a woman who would like to make aliyah to Israel and her husband refuses. Is she allowed to divorce her husband by force and demand of him alimony, which in Hebrew is the ketubah, in order to make aliyah, or must she abide by his position? So the halacha brought down the Shulchan Aruch is that she can demand a divorce and demand alimony because she wants to fulfill a mitzvah, and he refuses. And the Pitchei Tshuva, the famous commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, says that basically this is following the point of view of Nachmanides, Ramban, that it's a mitzvah from the Torah to live in the land of Israel even in the time of the diaspora. And therefore, a husband cannot prevent his wife from making aliyah because it's a mitzvah from the Torah. And if he's not going to give in and she wants, she can demand her ketubah and her divorce. That means that the Shulchan Aruch basically decides the halacha in favor of Nachmanides on this issue of the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel. Another place where we can see from the Shulchan Aruch where it decides in favor of Nachmanides is actually an interesting place. It has nothing to do theoretically, well, it has a lot to do, but also indirectly. It's the laws of Tisha B'Av, of all things. In the laws of Tisha B'Av, in Orach Chaim, Taf Kuf Samach Aleph, which is 561. So there's a discussion there. If you see the destroyed cities of Judea, whether you're supposed to rent your garments or not. A Jew rents their garments when another Jew dies. A Jew rents their garments when they hear of a direct relative who died. And when they hear of a Torah scroll that was burned or see. So here it says, if a person sees the cities of Judea in their destruction, you say a certain verse, and then you rent your garments. If you see Jerusalem in its destruction, you say another verse, and you tear your garments. And then if you see the Temple Mount in its destruction, again you tear your garments 3 times. Kriya. So right away, the commentators want to know what's the definition of Jerusalem destroyed, of the cities of Judea destroyed. By the way, aside from Jerusalem, you have Bethlehem, you have Hebron in Judea. So what is the definition they want to know? Both the Ber Hetev and also the Mishnah Brura, the famous commentator Israel Meir Cohen from Lithuania, who died in 1935. What is the definition? So they quote the Beit Yosef, Joseph Caro's commentary to the Tur, and I'll read to you what the Mishnah Brura says. It says the definition of destruction is even if Jews inhabit these cities, but the Ishmaelites, meaning a foreign government, is sovereign, that's considered destroyed. Even if all the houses are built in the most beautiful architecture, and all the lawns are clean, and the garbage is taken out, and they have beautiful shops with the best food, furniture, whatever you want, but it's a foreign government, that's called destroyed. In other words, they are following the opinion of Nachmanides that it's crucial to fulfill the mitzvah that there be a Jewish sovereignty in the land. So here we have 2 proofs from the Shulchan Aruch, from the Code of Jewish Law, which normally doesn't even discuss these things, that there must be a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, and that there's a mitzvah to make aliyah to the land of Israel, and both of them even during the time of the diaspora. So, where does that leave us? Where are we holding according to this? The last thing I want to mention is the question is like this. Okay, so we know there's supposed to be Jewish sovereignty, but if the event happens and there's a possibility of Jewish sovereignty, like what happened in 1948, does it have to be a monarchy? Because after all, the Torah always talks about a monarchy. Can it be another form of government? Can it be a democracy? Can it be one of the different forms? Can it be an oligarchy? Can it be whatever? Okay. In other words, must it be a monarchy? So there's an interesting discussion in the responsa of called Tzitz Eliezer. That's Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, was a rabbi in Jerusalem, passed away around 25 years ago. Well-known posek, well-known decider of halacha, and really among all, I would say, factions of Judaism here in Israel. And he has a discussion on whether you need a king in order to have what's called kibush rabim, which means in order to legitimize the fact that the army is taking over an area. You know, in biblical times, as in the Second Temple period, if the king wanted to tell the army to fight a war, you had to ask the high priest, you had to ask the prophet, um, basically in order to do such, and you had to have a king, of course, from the not only from the tribe of Judah, but from the family of King David. So you need three things: you need a king and a prophet and a high priest, and so we don't. And you need actually the breastplate, the Urim and Tumim. So we don't have that. So the question is, what is the value or what is the legitimacy of things? I can make it even more extreme. When the state of Israel calls up conscription and tells people they must go into the army and risk their lives for the state, is there halachic ramifications? Is this a legitimate thing in the eyes of halacha? Because there is no king, there's no prophet, there's no high priest, there's no Sanhedrin, which is supposed to also be consulted when you go out to war. So what gives the legitimacy? And then from the eyes point of view of halacha, this is part of that question. So he says, we have to discuss the question of kibush rabim, which means conquests made by the collective of the Jewish people. Because normally the condition is that you have to have a king and you have to have a prophet, and today there's no king and no prophet. But still we can find a remedy for this in the writings of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook in his Mishpat Kohen, Siman Kufim Daled, where he talks about the Hasmonean kings and their wars over the Syrian government, the Seleucids. Because it seems that even when you don't have a king, then judges and ministers seem to be okay, because the Talmud refers to the Hasmoneans as the Hasmonean kingdom. And the Talmud also recognizes the conquests of the Hasmonean kingdom in the land of Israel as having halachic ramifications. And since the Hasmoneans were from the tribe of Levi because they're Kohanim, that means they didn't even qualify to be kings. So that means that the Talmud sees leaders that the people supported, just like the judges of old in the book of Shoftim, as being legitimate leaders. So therefore, you could say the same thing today, that these leaders might not be kings, but they're legitimate from a halachic point of view. And the same thing is discussed by Yaakov Emdin in his book Mor Uktzia, that also says that the conquests of the Hasmoneans were considered legitimate by the Talmud and therefore remained as if in the hands of Israel, remained in the hand of Israel until the Galut, until the diaspora. And also he says, see my book on the laws of nations, Hilchot Medina, where I also try to prove that this is correct. So today, the president and the prime minister and the government should be something, and especially since the majority of Jews in the land of Israel support them, and there are more than 600,000 Jews, he was writing many years ago. So therefore, for all of the collective decisions of the nation, this should be okay, halachically. And therefore, even the conquests that are done by the Israeli army, which of course is supported by the people, and we have among them, he adds, many soldiers who are God-fearing. So definitely this should be considered legitimate. And then he also says, and look what Rav Yaakov Emdin wrote in his Kundras, talking about the settling of the land of Israel, that he said that it's obvious that all the conquests of Yerovam ben Yoash, the biblical king, which the Torah testifies that he did all the terrible things in the eyes of God because he still went in the ways of Yerovam ben Nevat, who had sinned against Israel. However, his conquests were still considered legitimate conquests. So not only are we saying, according to Tzitz Eliezer says, that a legitimate leader can be instead of a king if you don't have a king at the time, but even if that legitimate leader is not 100% observant, it's definitely better than Yoram ben Yoash, who actually was an idol worshiper. So it's very interesting then that the Halacha has taken this direction that government could be also considered legitimate. It doesn't matter if it's a democracy or a monarchy or an oligarchy, as long as the people are behind the government and supporting it. So basically, in a nutshell, what I wanted to show you today is a discussion how you can go from the sources, the biblical sources, which start off discussing a king, which is, of course, the biblical form of monarchy, and how it's understood in halacha there's a mitzvah to have a king, which really interprets there is a mitzvah to have Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. This is the way Nachmanides understood it, that in the mitzvah of dwelling in the land, there are three items. One is a Jewish sovereignty, the second one is to settle the land, and the third is to make sure you take it over if you have the opportunity. And this is also has ramifications in halacha, in the question of a woman who wants to make aliyah against her husband's wishes, and in the laws of Tisha B'Av, the definition of when you rent your garments, which today we do not rent our garments in Jerusalem or the Old City because the sovereign power is the state of Israel. And so I wanted to point this out and to say that Yom Ha'atzmaut is not only a national holiday, but actually has halachic meanings and bearings to it too. Toda Rabba. I wish everyone a very meaningful Yom HaZikaron and a happy Yom Ha'atzmaut. Shalom, shalom.